They're just mad because they're losing members and they're losing the grip, their privilege on society that they've had for fucking forever.
Yes, I think from what I read, atheism isn't necessarily on the rise, but the so-called nuns category, NONES, who are describing themselves as having no religion, is pretty dramatically on the rise.
Yeah, not nuns, not the NU.
Right.
I see them everywhere. Them in them penguin suits, god damn it.
Hello and welcome to Trolling with Logic, the podcast where we bring the hammer down on pseudoscience, ignorance, and unreason on a bi-weekly basis. I'm your host, Nathan Dickey, and with me today is Kitch, I think the only one who is going to be here, at least for the time being. How's it going?
Doing very well. How's yourself?
I'm fine. Joining us as our guest today is Chris Waston. Chris is a self-described secular, sarcastic, and screwed-up Southern SJW and a skeptic. I believe I got that tagline right.
Yes, you did. Good job.
All right. Chris is also the one and only host of the Podunk Polymath Podcast, or the Triple P for short, a podcast I personally enjoy very much. Chris joins us on the show today to discuss, among other things, the skeptical movement, what it is, what direction it's going in, and what needs to change. So we're kind of taking a meta look at skepticism, kind of taking a step back from all the specific subjects we've been looking at in detail. Welcome to the show, Chris Waston.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So to get this ball rolling, tell us a bit about your podcast and what motivated and inspired you to start it.
Well, my podcast, you already told the tagline, so we got that out of the way. I try to interview people from a social justice angle. A lot of it is I just want to learn things about certain subjects, like sex work was one, sexual assault in the military, domestic violence, stuff like that. I also interview other podcasters and try to get an idea of where they're coming from. And sometimes I do atheist/secular related subjects. So
yeah, you always get a lot of really great people on, and I agree that's one of the best reasons to do podcasting is to learn from the people you have on.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to do this, because I had a podcast before, and that was more of a kind of angry atheist slant. So I wanted to do something that was a little more positive, I guess, and try to learn from people and put up people's stories that may not usually get told on other mediums.
Yeah, absolutely. So whereabouts are you located?
I'm in the great state of Tennessee, in Music City, Nashville.
Yeah, what are some of the unique challenges that you would say come with being an openly secular, liberal-minded atheist and skeptic in the American South?
Well, I don't usually talk to people, except for on Facebook, because I'm just not big on talking. I'm just socially awkward. So, I don't really talk to people about it, I guess. I'm not, like in the closet. I just don't talk about it. So, but I've seen get a lot of hate, some stuff, if you look at social media. Although Nashville is a little more liberal than the surrounding area. So, there's a good balance, I think, for the most part. It's not like we're in fucking deep South Mississippi or something. So.
Right. Okay, so not too much of a challenge. Here on the West Coast, not really challenging to be openly atheist and secular-minded at all. It's a very liberal area overall, in general. But there are other pervasive mindsets that are cringeworthy in other ways. Not of the conservative type, but other types of silliness and unreason.
Of the woo variety?
The woo variety. There's a very large and loud anti-GMO movement here, and Ashland, Oregon, which is only about 15 miles away from where I live now, is like the epicenter of the whole anti-vaccine movement, where they were getting exemptions from the state government, philosophical and religious exemptions from vaccinations, and that town was featured in the Frontline documentary on the vaccine controversy, so-called controversy. So yeah, it varies from region to region. Let's talk about the historical figure whose face is featured as your podcast's artwork and whom you identify as the show's Patronus, Charles Chilton Moore. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because the more I look into who this man was, I think more atheists, skeptics, really all active secularists in general should be aware of him. Who was this man and what did he do?
Well, he was editor. First of all, he was grandson of Barton Stone, who was like one of there's something called the Restoration Movement, which basically was a start, a lot of it, to modern day church-going folk here in the South. So he was a grandson of that guy, and he went atheist pretty well early on. He was the editor of the Bluegrass Blade, which was a newspaper which featured articles about different subjects of the time, but from a secular slant. Of course, he was alive like in the late 1800s, so a lot of it was, human rights and such, and, he was an abolitionist. So he was kind of a progressive for his time. He was actually put in jail, basically for blasphemy. He wrote a book called Behind the Bars about his experience in jail. His sentence was commuted by McKinley in 1900, late 1800s, I forgot the date. So when I was looking for somebody to represent the show, I was looking for somebody in the southern region, and I kind of got laughed at. It's like, haha, there's nobody like that. That's funny. But no, he came up, and he was actually, I just found out recently that Answers in Genesis did an article on one of his quotes, and I thought that was extremely hilarious.
Yeah, tell us about that. What did they say about him?
Oh, they took this quote that he made, basically. He's obviously against religion, talking shit about it. I don't remember the exact quote, but they just basically went line by line trying to dissect it, and I use that term loosely, interjecting their own propaganda, Christian propaganda bullshit. So if you got Answers in Genesis dissecting one of your quotes, then, yeah. Even though you've been dead for, over 100 years?
Yeah, that's something to be proud of. I think Answers in Genesis is concerned enough to make a statement about a single thing you wrote. He also has the distinction, speaking of accolades people get on the part of dissenters who are not really intending to raise somebody up with a criticism, but do so unwittingly. He was dubbed Kentucky's most hated man.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. And there's actually a biography about him under that title.
February 1899, he was indicted for mailing obscene literature.
Yeah, it's the Bluegrass Blade.
It was deemed obscene because of its anti-religion messages?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. They try to use other excuses, but that's basically what it was.
Obscene, that's funny. I've had religious friends of mine take issue with my stances on things, especially not so much nowadays, but years ago when I was more of a firebrand and more angry about religion, but I've never been called obscene. So that's kind of an indication of how the times are changing with our language.
Well, some people still think it's obscene, I'm sure, but
oh yeah,
yeah, no, it's an indication that I thought that the First Amendment would have come into play with that. Was that used as a defense in court?
Yeah, but it was basically, they didn't care. The jury was made up of a bunch of religious people. So, of course, they're going to do with jury nullification. They're going to go against it anyway. That's part of the reason why McKinley, I think, commuted his sentence, because he knew it was bullshit under the First Amendment grounds.
So, getting on to the meat of our discussion, I mentioned the word firebrand, and that kind of leads us into this whole debate it hasn't been really front and center, but it's been kind of brewing in the background about whether skeptics, especially of the atheistic variety, should be diplomatic in their approach, should seek allies among religious moderates, and kind of police their own language so that they don't offend the religious, or whether the movement benefits more from the firebrand approach of being angry and vociferous and shrill is one word that I see thrown around a lot. What is your personal take on this debate?
Well, like I said, I started off as the angry atheist type, but I kind of progressed into, I guess, more of a, I don't know, not really diplomatic because I still get pissed off about stuff, but trying to see things more from a skeptical point of view and trying to look at the different sides of an issue, although I'm not one of those people who thinks that, there's automatically going to be two sides to every issue. Sometimes bullshit is bullshit regardless, and I don't need to see two sides of bullshit. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's place for both of them, to be honest with you. The firebrand is important, I think, to kind of get people motivated. The diplomat's important for people to talk to people who are not necessarily on our side, that can kind of explain things a little better and try to get them to understand where they're coming from. So, like I said, I think it's a double-edged sword there.
Yeah, I kind of fall on the we need both side as well. I think it's more self-aware for secularists to be diplomatic so that when they're less angry, shrill, vociferous, whatever adjective you want to use, and they're more diplomatic and they're more of the good cop, I think that's more conducive to being a self-aware person and realizing that there may be things you believe currently that are not true. And also, it's fairly well known, fairly common knowledge in our movement that most skeptics and atheists were once believers. And that's the whole reason they are part of the vocal movement, is because according to the principle of people who campaign against smoking, for example, the most powerfully tend to be former smokers. So the things you once believed that you no longer believe and you believe causes great harm in society, you're going to be loud about that. So we do need to be loud about it, but we also need to choose our battles wisely, I think, and gear our messages differently depending on the kind of people we're talking to.
I totally agree.
But I always kind of advocate, though we don't have the discipline sometimes to stick to it, is when it's debating or discussing these various topics with with somebody of, I don't want to say opposition, but you know what I mean. Adopt a strategy of how would you explain this to somebody or a friend in the pub, like, or just a calm approach. Keep it lively, but keep lively. You don't have to be kind of a robot about it, but just friendly. There are times where I think getting angry can be of help, but again, it's kind of a difficult topic to discuss because it's not one kind of strategy fits all. It's really kind of a topic you really need to get a feel for the person that you're talking to and the feel for the people who are also listening in. If that makes sense, I'm kind of not with it today. It may be a mad ramble.
That's what we're all about on Trolling with Logic, is mad rambles.
Nothing wrong with that, man.
Nope. And I think the places where we need to be angry about things is the places where you're addressing the kinds of people and issues that aren't worth your time, but you want to kind of divert people you care about away from. So, hurtful, bigoted, closed-minded people and worldviews. I think there's something to be said about not giving a platform to that kind of thing, speaking out harshly against those kind of things, and the free speech crowd will object to that often. But I think the disconnect there is that some people don't understand that we don't have to give everybody a platform.
Yeah. Deplatforming is definitely something that seems to be a good tool, and some people don't understand the difference between, well, I don't think they even know what free speech even means in the context of what it's supposed to be for, which is government restricting speech. It doesn't have anything to do with you being able to say whatever the fuck you want, and not get any backlash for it. That's not how that works. That's not how any of this works.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, I'm kind of new to the subject of no platform because it's not really something that's really common over here in Ireland, but for people maybe outside the States, what is this concept of no platforming?
Basically, it just means not to give, a platform for people whose speech it can be considered hateful or disruptive or anything of that nature. As an example, Milo Yiannopoulos, whatever his name is, has been deplatformed in several places because a lot of colleges won't allow him to come on campus because he has demonstrated that he is capable of saying shitty things, especially against LGBTQI people. And he has actually called out, in one play, he called out a transgender person by name. And she wasn't out. I'm pretty sure she wasn't out yet. So, that puts her in danger. Especially if you're not ready to come out, you can be harassed or potentially even harmed physically for that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, basically, yeah, it's choosing to not give a platform to somebody who you think is perpetrating hate speech, I guess you could say.
Yeah, with the current climate and with Trump being in office, modern times now are a good time to put into practice the no platforming philosophy, I guess you could call it. Because these people are obviously vocal enough that they have a platform somewhere. Their speech isn't being shut down everywhere.
Yeah, the whole idea of the marketplace of ideas and these sort of things, bad ideas need to be confronted with good ideas, it's all well and good, and it sounds good on paper, but a lot of times that doesn't take into account the fact that certain marginalized groups don't get equal time when it comes to that sort of thing. And plus you have to look at the kind of physical harm speech can cause. Now, that's another thing that's been kind of thing lately, with speech being attack, basically, being equivalent to violence. And some people say, well, it's words. Words can't cause violence. But words can be a direct cause of certain acts of violence. And there was a case in the Supreme Court that it's been quite a while since it was decided. The idea of imminent threat. Like if you say, go kill that person, that's considered imminent threat, and that therefore is not covered under free speech.
I think I know. I think I'm getting what you're saying there. Like one example that just springs to my head is Bill O'Reilly with the George Tiller incident. So he was always on Fox News, calling him Tiller the baby killer, and then somebody went and shot George Tiller.
Yeah, I actually talked about him. I was talking about the abortion issue, and we talked about him. He was shot in Wichita, Kansas at a church. And he had actually been previously shot before in both arms. So, yeah. And he kept going. You gotta admire that.
Oh, yeah. And I think the whole marketplace of ideas concept is largely a myth. I don't think there's so much of a marketplace of ideas as there is a marketplace of emotions that are all vying for attention, and some voices, demographics within society are louder than others, kind of drowning some other voices out. And I think it says something important.
I like that concept of marketplace of emotions as well. That was quite good.
But that's where the effectiveness of being loud and angry comes in, I think. You're dealing with emotions that manifest themselves as hateful speech, fired up by not just fringe voices, like on racist websites and white supremacist groups and such, but also in places that a lot of people don't expect to find it. It's bubbling under the surface of, especially AM talk radio, with voices like Alex Jones and some of the big conservative names in talk radio and conservative news shows. And this administration is really encouraging talk that wouldn't be viewed as normal even 8 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, who knows. What do you think about that, Chris? Do you think that hateful language that wouldn't be tolerated less than a decade ago is being normalized today?
Oh, I don't think there's any question of that. Trump has enabled a lot of people, encouraged basically people to say shit that they normally wouldn't have said, but they already thought, but they just weren't saying it out loud. So, I mean, it's encouraging a lot of hate groups. I mean, the KKK are coming out, neo-Nazis, white supremacist types, militia types, sovereign citizens, all those fuckers. They're crawling out of the woodwork like fucking ants. And I think it's at least an indirect correlation between that and the rise of Trump and the fact that he could just go out in the name. He's so honest, he just says what he thinks. Oh, really? I heard somebody say, so is your crazy uncle who watches Fox News, but that's not necessarily a good thing, you know?
I mean, what we need is not people who just say what they think without considering the consequences. What we need is deliberation of thought and more of an intellectual, reflective person.
A sane person.
Yeah, that's the kind of person we need being a leader in any position, let alone leader of the free world. And we see the effects of this throughout the globe. Trump's actions, policies having negative effects in so many areas and so many different places of the world.
I think it's a wave that's been taking place. This was before Trump, especially in Europe. And I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of threat from ISIS and the kind of xenophobia that's kind of taken hold. A lot of refugees coming from Syria into Europe. And it's kind of created this wave of anti-immigrant fervor and racism, to be quite honest with you. And of course, some politicians have tried to stoke that. Politicians are opportunists for the most part. So now that's not to say they don't believe what they're like. Marine Le Pen in France, who got shellacked, thankfully, didn't get a stronghold, I don't think. Brexit is another example of this sort of isolationist ideology, I think. So I think you're seeing sort of a worldwide phenomenon right now, and it's bringing out the worst of people, to be honest with you.
Do you think the skeptic movement, however you want to define that, and that's something we should bring up a little later, is what is the skeptical movement, and or what is the atheist movement, or the secularist movement? But whatever brand you want to take to consider this kind of movement of people who value reason and rationality, is there a role for us to play in working to end this worldwide fervor that's been building up for who knows how many years and it's reached a culmination? Or are we as a movement not equipped to deal with this and are we too much of a niche movement?
I think we need to define our terms a bit, because just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're a skeptic, and vice versa.
Right.
So I think skepticism, and then of course the SJW part, the social justice, kind of plays in there. It's kind of another thing between the SJW types and the anti-SJW types. So if we're talking about, let's go with the skeptical movement, or you could go with secular humanism, which is a whole different thing. But as a general rule, I think that a lot of people don't get as involved as they could, because a lot of people, there seems to be a disproportionate amount of introverts in the movement. So I think a lot of that is kind of like, what can I really do? Now, of course, there are things you can do behind the scenes. Not everybody has to be on the front lines of signs shouting at people or whatever. I mean, there's other roles that can be played. You can contribute your time, your money. Maybe, if you're a computer guy, help out with websites maybe, or hell, clean up and, just anything. And I actually talked about this on my when I recorded last night. We were talking about how you can get involved in activism without actually feeling like you have to be out there marching or whatever. So I think we need more, the secular types need to kind of get more involved, because they sure as hell on the other side, the right wing seems to be really good at organizing their folks to get out and march and shit. So I think we need to match that energy and that dedication.
Yeah, and they're not just better at doing that. The conservative crowd has, since at least the 1960s or 1950s, they've been better at marketing their message and communicating their ideals. I mean, we all know that scientists have an extremely difficult time communicating the principles of science to the general public. For whatever reason, that's never been a problem, it seems, with the conservative movement. For decades, they've figured out pretty early on how to effectively communicate and draw people in using emotional appeals. And the secular humanist movement, which is, I think, the moniker I prefer to kind of describe this whole reason and rationality movement, I think they can benefit from learning a little bit of psychology and learning how to speak to people's emotions. We've got the debate and the reason and the rationality part figured out, and we can communicate that to people who are likewise inclined, but that's not most people. So we need to learn the emotions game as well, but we also need to figure out how to be honest about it and accurate, and so that's the challenge there.
I was just going to say a very good case study, in fact, was the gay marriage referendum that took place here in Ireland, where the Yes campaign was very, very good at connecting to voters at an emotional, personal level. They made it about how this campaign or how this referendum will influence people on their daily and personal lives, about how important it was for the gay community to have the access to marriage, to have that right to marriage. And it really showed in the election results, or the referendum results.
I was very pleasantly surprised about that outcome, to be honest with you, because I think Americans, well, at least Americans who pay attention, kind of have this idea of Ireland as some kind of Catholic theocracy or something where you can't get abortions, priests are running around everywhere telling people what to do. You know, of course, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, obviously, but and a conservative Catholic country in the rural areas, as usual, per usual in most places, they're usually the stronger in that aspect, I would think.
Kind of my own experience is that it's pushing the opposite way now. The country is becoming very, very secular and liberal. The church attendances are drastically dropping, and not even just here in Dublin. Also, when I was living in Cork, it was pretty much the same thing. But then again, that's just kind of a very poor sample set to make a kind of general statement about the country. But there are parts of the country. We had a girl on from, I can't remember where she was. She was from the country out west somewhere. It's writing for us about her experience of being an atheist in a Catholic country, and some of the stories that she told me were very surprising. So, on the whole, I think the country is moving towards a more secular and kind of a liberal place without the Catholic Church. In fact, there was a story quite recently about I've forgotten the name of the hospital. I think it's St. Vincent's. That actually was under the control, or was going to be under the ownership. The nuns, I can't remember its order of nuns though, for the life of me. I didn't expect it to be talking about it. But quite recently they announced that they're giving up their ownership after much pressure from the Irish people.
Actually, yeah, I heard that story. That's definitely, I'm glad it's going in that direction. Definitely.
And I think it's the likes of kind of just, I'd say the internet has really been responsible for that. And the better kind of the experiences of the past generation, and each generation that's kind of gone on has kind of been influencing the next to stepping away from the church. But that's a bit of a segue.
It's definitely important, I think, to explore that. I mean, religion. You can say what you will, but religion has caused a lot of pain in the world in the last 2,000 years. So
I think that's a huge understatement. That'd be hard for anybody to contest. I don't think even the religious contest that anymore. A lot of really great people who are also religious have openly acknowledged the need for reform, is one word you could use, although that might be, because of the historical significance of Reformation, that might be a little strong, but Christianity is trying to move in a more positive direction, not usually successfully, because the older, more traditional, conservative way of doing Christianity still seems to prevail in most places, but there is a lot of recognition, I think, that Christianity needs to change or die, which is the title of one of Bishop John Shelby Spong's books. He's an Episcopalian priest who wants to reform Christianity, make it something new to adapt to the times and to adapt to our changing understanding of people.
Well, I think that's a noble if a bit naive, to be honest with you. I don't know if that's really possible, at least in today's climate.
I don't think it's possible either. I think what's needed is a sea change of one's mindset, where the supernatural isn't front and center, and humans are front and center. So we need humanism, not theism, in my opinion.
Yeah, and to be clear, there are religious folk who are humanists.
Yes.
So it's not just secular humanism. There's also, I guess, religious humanism as well. I honestly don't care. If you're a humanist, I don't give a shit, what you believe, as long as you keep your beliefs out of government. And there's a lot of people who do. There's a lot of people who advocate for separation of church and state who happen to be religious, because they actually know what can happen if religion gets its paws on the government, wheel. Or just reference Middle Ages in Europe and all the shit that was going on with Catholics and the Protestants. All the kind of wars that were fought over. Hell, in Ireland, it's the same thing. The Troubles. I mean, it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's the religious who should be the most supportive of separation of church and state, because it's beneficial to them and their private practice of their personal religion to not have the government interfere either for or against them.
I agree. Totally. Obviously.
So there are other debates going on in the skeptical, atheist, secular humanist movement, and I've seen a lot of religious pundits and articles kind of gleefully commenting on this idea that there's a civil war that's tearing apart the reason and rationality-oriented movement, and that we're just tearing ourselves apart. But I think maybe a civil war, to borrow their kind of hyperbolic language, could be considered a positive thing. What do you think? Because the kind of voices that liberal-minded people wouldn't really want to be associated with are kind of taking some hard blows, as they should.
Look, as human beings, this kind of shit is going to happen. I mean, it's just inevitable. Anytime you're in a group, there's going to be group dynamics that take hold, and there's going to be rifts. I mean, the religious can't say a fucking thing, considering there's like probably thousands of fucking, split. How many flavors of Christianity are there, for Christ's sake? Come on. Christ's sake, that was kind of unintentional. But anyway, so they can't say shit, and like I said, it's a human thing. It's human nature to do that. And is there a civil war? I mean, like you said, that's overstated just a little bit. I mean, yeah, there's disagreements. I mean, but that's going to happen in any group, and there are people who stir shit for fans or otherwise, That's just the way it is. And yeah, I think in the end, we like skeptics and such, and atheists like to think they're kind of above the fray, that they're better at, kind of discerning between what's good or bad. But let's just face it, there's always going to be an element of just petty ignorance, and infighting in any group. So we're not above that. Now, that's not to say that it's not annoying and it's not disappointing, because there are other battles we need to be fighting and not worrying about who or who not is going to punch Nazis and shit, And I know exactly 3 people that would actually do that. Everybody else needs to shut the fuck up and sit down. You ain't punching no goddamn Nazis. Okay? Just calm down. Take a breath and just calm down. Come on.
Oh, that was good.
Yeah, so the whole thing's ridiculous. But, I mean, yeah, it's healthy sometimes to get air that stuff out and just kind of, sunlight's the best disinfectant. Mm-hmm. Although I don't know if that's even true or not, because sunlight is radiation. But anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That analogy's not great, but it's been around for a while. So
I think it's especially to be expected as something naturally going to happen with a group of free thinkers, atheists, secularists, skeptics, who, by virtue of being those things, have learned how to think for themselves. And so disagreements are inevitable, and I think it would be pretty telling the other way around if skeptics always agreed on everything and formed a cohesive whole that always moved in one direction on everything. I think that would be a worse image for us to have in the eyes of other people.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not worried what they say, to be honest with you. It doesn't matter. It's not like they're going to care regardless. It's not like they're going to treat us any better. So what if there's infighting? Who gives a shit? You know, it just means we come out stronger at the end. To me, anyway.
Yep, I agree.
And they're just mad because they're losing members and they're losing the grip, their privilege on society that they've had for fucking forever.
Yes, I think from what I read, atheism isn't necessarily on the rise, but the so-called nuns category, NONES, who are describing themselves as having no religion, is pretty dramatically on the rise.
Yeah, not nuns, not the NUN.
Right.
I see him everywhere. Them in them penguin suits, god damn it. That's definitely an encouraging statistic, I think. Yeah. And internet's part of it, like Kitch said. The rise of the internet has allowed people to kind of gather knowledge without having to rely on so-called authority figures, like your local priest or your, pastor or whatever. You can find out on your own, and of course they don't like that, That's why the Protestant Reformation happened, because you had to go through the priest in order to talk to God. And Martin Luther is like, fuck that, we're going straight to God. Obviously, I just like to run my mouth about different shit.
That's what we want. Whenever we get a guest on, we hope that they'll do most of the talking for us. So.
That's what I do with my show. Yeah, I basically just guide the conversation, but I just let them do all the work for the most part, because I'm lazy, I guess.
And with the proliferation of information on the internet, there's also the downside to that, which is the proliferation of bad information and figuring out how to weed out the good from the bad and the accurate from the inaccurate. And that's why conspiracy theories become dominant and pervasive. That's why fake news becomes pervasive as well. So I think there's room in the skeptical movement for all sorts of different specialty interests. So, for example, our show, Trolling with Logic, we tend to focus more on the science issues and how that impacts society, and kind of correcting misinformation about like food fads and modern technologies, and trying to dispel fears of modern technology like nuclear or GMOs. Although I think we've branched out and explored things outside our comfort zone as well. So there's room for that. There's room for, obviously, there's a need for skeptics speaking out in support of LGBTQI and similar issues. And there's also room for, people who are interested in things that don't matter as much, but that have personal meaning to them, like Bigfoot, UFOs, things like that. And chemtrails, they're poisonous. Chemtrails are fun. Yeah. Those conversations are just fun, and they're educational at the same time. And I think kind of presenting a correct view of reality spills over into other areas as well. Mm-hmm. So educating somebody enough to the point where they're willing to discard their conspiracy theory, for example. The underlying principle behind that decision to discard a conspiracy theory and accept the reality also spills over into things like accepting human beings for who they are and what they identify as. Oh yeah, definitely. And of course, unfortunately, that's not always the case. There are plenty of so-called skeptics out there who are assholes. Oh yeah. So. I think too many, in fact. I think that's a consequence of not applying reason and rationality equally in all areas. Yeah, it's compartmentalization is what it is. Or maybe reason and rationality itself isn't sufficient, so maybe they do apply equally, but they lack a certain
Empathy.
They lack empathy and compassion. So that's
That's the determining factor to me. The lack of empathy seems to be rife in not just the skeptical movement like we're talking about specifically, but I think as a general rule, empathy seems to be lacking in the human species. And we are fucked as a species unless we get our empathy on, okay?
Yeah, and empathy has application to so many areas, including the one area that will fuck us up in the very near future, which is climate change. A lot of conservatives who oppose climate change don't do so because they have evidence on their side, but because they're worried about their pocketbooks. So if they had a certain much-needed level of empathy, they might forget about their pocketbooks and their own self-interest for a while and consider other people in other areas that are more affected by climate disruption.
Yeah, good luck with that. They're not going to be happy until they get every last drop of oil, no matter where it is on the planet.
Yeah, and that's also not just a conservative problem, it's a human problem, because as a human species, we're very short-sighted and very focused on the short term and not on the long term. And that, in turn, is a consequence of our evolutionary history, I think, where we had to think fast on our feet to survive and react quickly. We have the flight or fight response, which leads us to act on impulse rather than reason. But I think we've come to a point in our technology and cultural development where we can kind of put aside some of the high alert alarm systems in our brain, focus more on deliberation and thinking.
We could. That doesn't mean we are, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, just the fact that when you brought up climate change there, it actually reminded me of, I think it was a Concordance video where he mentioned a study that showed that the majority, or not majority, but there's a good portion of climate skeptics, for want of a better term, they're actually well educated. It's that their emotional connection to the subject has caused them to become biased or select from the literature just key things that support their idea. It's a kind of reinforcing their own bias. They don't look for the opposing evidence. They just look for the evidence that supports their own thinking. And I think that's an important factor in a lot of these kind of discussions in the skeptic community, is that own self-supporting bias. And I know that I found that I caught myself doing it a couple of times. I think it's something that we are all guilty of doing at least some point in our life, and it's a powerful thing to fight as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and he's also right that we're all prone to this self-selection bias. Science, you're supposed to start with a hypothesis and come to a conclusion. People come to a conclusion beforehand and try to make the facts fit their preconceived notion. That's definitely not a good thing.
Yeah, it is something we're all guilty of. It's confirmation bias, which is pervasive and prevalent. It's part of human nature, and it's the most studied cognitive bias of them all. Very well documented. So, as we're getting ready to sign off, we'll give you a chance to kind of shout out your own show some more by asking what your personal favorite episode of your show has been, and like your favorite interviewee, that kind of thing.
Oh boy, it's like picking your favorite child.
I get if somebody listening to this hasn't heard your show before, their interest has been piqued a little bit, what episode would you point them to first to kind of get them interested and want to listen to more?
I like the polyamory episode. It was actually a two-parter. Because I had like 4 different people on there talking about it. It was definitely something that I would have been interested in because I know so many people in the community were part of that group, I guess you could say, orientation. And I thought it would be interesting to find out what it was really all about. And that would be my favorite episode from that standpoint. From the social justice standpoint, I would say that Social Justice with Sincere Carabo was a good one. He's just very good at representing He's with the American Humans Association, a great writer, one of the best writers I've seen out there, to be honest. And he knows how to basically put shit where you can understand it. So those would be the two main ones, I think, that I would point to.
Great. Well, does anybody have any final thoughts?
I just want to thank Chris for his time and coming onto the podcast. It's been very good. It's been a very interesting discussion, and definitely echo and support that anyone listening check out his podcast.
Aaron go brah? Is that still a thing they say in Ireland?
Aaron go brah?
Yeah.
I think so. My Irish is diabolical.
Do they still is Celtic whatever you call Irish still taught in
it's mandatory up until your final year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I did the higher level up until my junior cert, which is kind of like the midway in high school, and then I dropped down to the pass level because I got like 15% in my Christmas exam. I don't have a head for languages. I was always into science. So
yeah, I can definitely understand that. I took French in high school. I quite enjoyed the language, so some of it stuck, but not whole lot.
Same, I took French as well. I was able to just about stay in that higher class, but I had to take to a tutor.
Was it a French tutor? Ooh la la. I'm sorry, that sounds like...
Actually, yes. She was actually French.
Oh boy, that sounds like a porno waiting to happen. Anyway.
And on that note...
Yeah, where can people find you? I guess we talked about your podcast, but where specifically can they go to find you and follow you and all that?
The main website's thepodunkpolymath.com. I'm on Twitter at Podunk Polymath, Facebook / guess what? Actually, I just changed. No, it's the Podunk Polymath still. But I just changed the official Facebook page name to the Podunk Polymath Podcast. It's still under that. It's still the Podunk Polymath, though, if you look for it. Of course, I am on major podcatchers. I'm on Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, and all that kind of good stuff. You can become a part of the Podunk Polymath Podcast Posse Facebook group. If you go to groups / the Podunk Polymath Podcast Posse, all those words being separated by periods, because I want to make things difficult.
And that's a great group, by the way. Lots of great people in there. We'll have links to all of that in the show notes. And with that, thank you, Chris, for coming on with us today.
Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you for listening to Trolling with Logic. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. If you love the show, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Supporting us at $5 or more per episode will get you access to exclusive, patron-only bonus content, early access to shows before everyone else, and other incentives. We are an amateur production, but with your patronage, we can help improve our audio quality and cover the costs for doing the show. We are grateful for anything you can pledge to the show. Go to www.patreon.com/trollingwithlogic to sign up if you are so inclined. We want to thank our 3 patrons who currently have chosen to support us. These patrons are Microbloganism, Josh at the Society for the Advancement of Science, and Avinash Kumar. Thank you very much for your support, which is helping us out. Thanks to you 3, we have now been able to hire a professional audio editor, so now you can all look forward to higher quality audio. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests you would like to hear on this show, let us know on Twitter or on our Facebook page. Thanks again for listening.
They're just mad because they're losing members and they're losing the grip, their privilege on society that they've had for fucking forever.
Yes, I think from what I read, atheism isn't necessarily on the rise, but the so-called nuns category, NONES, who are describing themselves as having no religion, is pretty dramatically on the rise.
Yeah, not nuns, not the NU.
Right.
I see him everywhere. Them in them penguin suits, god damn it.
Hello and welcome to Trolling with Logic, the podcast where we bring the hammer down on pseudoscience, ignorance, and unreason on a bi-weekly basis. I'm your host, Nathan Dickey, and with me today is Kitch, I think the only one who is going to be here, at least for the time being. How's it going?
Doing very well. How's yourself?
I'm fine. Joining us as our guest today is Chris Watson. Chris is a self-described secular sarcastic from the people you have on.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to do this, because I had a podcast before, and that was more of a kind of angry atheist slant. So I wanted to do something that was a little more positive, I guess, and try to learn from people and put up people's stories that may not usually get told on other mediums.
Yeah, absolutely. So, whereabouts are you located?
I'm in the great state of Tennessee, in Music City, Nashville.
Yeah, what are some of the unique challenges that you would say come with being an openly secular, liberal-minded atheist and skeptic in the American South?
Well, I don't usually talk to people, except for on Facebook, because I'm just not big on talking. I'm just socially awkward. So, you know, I don't really talk to people about it, I guess. I'm not, like in the closet. I just don't talk about it. So, but I've seen get a lot of hate, some stuff, if you look at social media. Although Nashville is a little more liberal than the surrounding area. So,
that's true.
There's a good balance, I think, for the most part. It's not like we're in fucking deep South Mississippi or something. So.
Right. Okay, so not too much of a challenge. Here on the West Coast, not really challenging to be openly atheist and secular-minded at all. It's a very liberal area overall, in general. But there are other pervasive mindsets that are cringeworthy in other ways. Not of the conservative type, but other types of silliness and unreason.
Of the woo variety?
The woo variety. There's a very large and loud anti-GMO movement here, and Ashland, Oregon, which is only about 15 miles away from where I live now, is like the epicenter of the whole anti-vaccine movement, where they were getting exemptions from the state government, philosophical and religious exemptions from vaccinations, and that town was featured in the Frontline documentary on the vaccine controversy. So-called controversy. So yeah, it varies from region to region. Let's talk about the historical figure whose face is featured as your podcast's artwork and whom you identify as the show's Patronus, Charles Chilton Moore. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because the more I look into who this man was, I think more atheists, skeptics, really all active secularists in general should be aware of him. Who was this man and what did he do?
Well, he was editor. First of all, he was grandson of Barton Stone, who was like there's something called the Restoration Movement, which basically was a lot of it to modern day church-going folk here in the South. So he was a grandson of that guy, and he went atheist pretty well early on. He was the editor of the Bluegrass Blade, which was a newspaper which featured articles about different subjects of the time, but from a secular slant. Of course, he was alive like in the late 1800s, so a lot of it was, human rights and such. And, he was an abolitionist. So he was kind of a progressive for his time. He was actually put in jail, basically for blasphemy. He wrote a book called Behind the Bars about his experience in jail. His sentence was commuted by McKinley in 1900, late 1800s. I forgot the date. So when I was looking for somebody to represent the show, I was looking for somebody in the southern region, and I kind of got laughed at. It's like, haha, there's nobody like that. That's funny. But no, he came up, and he was actually, I just found out recently that Answers in Genesis did an article on one of his quotes, and I thought that was extremely hilarious.
Yeah, tell us about that. What did they say about him?
Oh, they took this quote that he made, basically. He's obviously against religion, talking shit about it. I don't remember the exact quote, but they just basically went line by line trying to dissect it, and I use that term loosely, interjecting their own propaganda, Christian propaganda bullshit. So if you got Answers in Genesis dissecting one of your quotes, then, yeah, even though you've been dead for, over 100 years.
Sarcastic and screwed up Southern SJW and a skeptic. I believe I got that tagline right.
Yes, you did. Good job.
All right. Chris is also the one and only host of the Podunk Polymath Podcast, or the Triple P for short, a podcast I personally enjoy very much. Chris joins us on the show today to discuss, among other things, the skeptical movement, what it is, what direction it's going in, and what needs to change. So we're kind of taking a meta look at skepticism, kind of taking a step back from all the specific subjects we've been looking at in detail. Welcome to the show, Chris Watson.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So to get this ball rolling, tell us a bit about your podcast and what motivated and inspired you to start it.
Well, my podcast, you already told the tagline, so we got that out of the way. I try to interview people from a social justice angle. A lot of it is I just want to learn things about certain subjects, like sex work was one, sexual assault in the military, domestic violence, stuff like that. I also interview other podcasters and try to get an idea of where they're coming from. And sometimes I do atheist/secular related subjects. So
yeah, you always get a lot of really great people on, and I agree that's one of the best reasons to do podcasting is to learn